Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a discussion around the publication of IDMC's report, A Decade of Displacement in the Middle East and North Africa. I hope you can all hear me well. We're joined today by an inspiring group of speakers whom I'll be introducing to all of you in a few minutes. But before I do, let me just go over a few logistical details. As you can see, the only videos which will be switched on during this event will be the speakers. So please do remember to keep your microphones muted throughout the discussion. If not, my team will be muting them for you. If you wish to ask a question to one of the speakers during the Q&A session in the last half hour of the event, please do so by writing your question in the Q&A or the chat function on the right-hand side of your Zoom screen. But you can also start sending us questions during the discussion itself, which will give enough time for my team to collect them and to organize them in time for the Q&A. The event will be translated simultaneously from English into Arabic and Arabic into English. You can choose your preferred language by clicking on the interpretation button in the black bar at the bottom of your screen. It should be self-explanatory, but for Arabic interpretation, please click on Arabic, and for English, please click on English. For those of you who are bilingual, you can also choose the option of not having any interpretation on and just keep the button off. You also have the option to completely mute the speaker and only hear the interpretation. The option is mute original audio. So if you don't click this, the default option is that you hear the speaker softly in the background with the interpreter's voice a little more loudly. I would now like to officially kickstart this event by showing you a short 1.5-minute video to introduce our report's main findings and the topic of today's discussion. And I'd like to thank our partner, in particular, the Al Jazeera Public Liberties and Human Rights Center in Doha, for making this video. Thank you very much. We're launching today a report which retraces the history of internal displacement in the Middle East and North Africa over the past decade. Last December marked 10 years since the Arab Spring protests started a process of reshaping the social, the political, and the economic landscape of the region. In many countries, this brought about new conflicts, which have devastated communities and generated levels of internal displacement that are unprecedented. With this have come heartbreaking stories of loss, humanitarian needs of overwhelming proportions, and impacts of on the region's social, economic, and political fabric that are likely to last well into the next decades. From Syria to Yemen, from Iraq to Palestine, the situation of IDPs and their families remains nothing short of critical. with humanitarian responders on the ground still struggling to deliver basic assistance in food, in shelter, health, and education, and operating sometimes in extremely difficult conditions. The hope of returning home, of sending their children back to school and accessing a stable livelihood still seems like a distant dream to many IDPs. The road to solutions is going to be a long one. They will require peace and stability, but also reconstruction, development, the regenerating of broken economies, and reconciling communities. Today, the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic is exposing IDPs to a new threat, with infection rates that are increasing among IDP communities from northwest Syria to Yemen, communities with already little access to quality healthcare or to vaccines, and who now, with the effects of border closures, of movement restrictions, are already feeling the side effects of this pandemic through a loss of income, through a further disruption of their children's school cycles, and growing food insecurity. What our report shows is that the MENA region, besides having already experienced such political turmoil this past decade, is also highly vulnerable to weather-related disasters and to the effects of climate change. The region is mostly arid and subject to seasonal rainfall. This means that when it rains, the poor soil absorption capacity and the lack of adequate drainage system can cause riverine, flash, or urban floods, which have proved in some areas to be devastating. Our available data shows that over the last decade, there were nearly 1.5 million new internal displacements due to disasters in the region. Floods were the ones that triggered the most displacement regionally. You may recall that Iran suffered its worst flood in 15 years, back in 2019, when 500,000 people had to leave their homes as a result. Flooding also continues to cause the displacement of IDPs who are already living in very difficult conditions as a result of conflict. You've no doubt seen the images coming from Syria, Iraq, and Yemen of tents and fragile shelters in IDP camps being washed away by water and families having to flee again as a result. Besides flooding, though, we've also seen cyclones and storms in Yemen, earthquakes in Iran, drought, and even a locust infestation in the Horn of Africa and Yemen. These have had a direct impact on people's food security and livelihoods, and on these countries' agricultural production as a whole. Now, internal displacement isn't just a humanitarian challenge. It has important economic and social consequences for IDPs, but also for their host communities and for countries as a whole. It has a destabilizing effect on the housing conditions, on the livelihoods, the health, education, and security of all those affected, and often significant financial repercussions that limit the ability of these people and these communities to contribute to the economy and the future prosperity of their country. We show, for example, in our report that the cost of meeting the needs of Syria's 6.5 million IDPs and their estimated loss of income for 1 year is more than $5.6 billion US, which represents about 14% of the country's GDP. If we apply similar calculations to other countries in the region, we see that this means a huge additional burden for governments and their international partners already struggling to provide basic services and to maintain stability. So what we show with this report today is that the drivers and the impact of conflict and disasters have become increasingly intertwined and are contributing to making displacement in the region both chronic and protracted. So it's time now to think about how to break this vicious cycle of instability and vulnerability, and which investments to prioritize across humanitarian action, but also prevention, disaster risk reduction, and sustainable development. Besides political will, it has to be about changing working methods, collecting different types of data, sharing information, and engaging in new partnerships and new dialogues. All this will be key to generate the political commitment that is needed to reach long-term solutions for IDPs in the region. I'm very pleased to be joined today by speakers who will be sharing their insights on how we can move the dial on the situation and make concrete and lasting changes, and who will be showing us what is already being done on the ground so that we can learn from these experiences and perhaps replicate them in the future. But before we move on to the panel discussion, I would like to give the floor for some introductory remarks to Mr. Nawaf Al-Hamadi, the Deputy Chief Executive Officer for International Programs at Qatar Charity, a key partner to IDMC and a co-organizer of this event today. Over to you, Mr. Al-Hamadi.
Thank you, Alexandra. I'm gonna start my speech in Arabic. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
So, peace be upon all of you. In the beginning, I would like to welcome and thank, I would like to welcome Ms. Alexandra Bilik, the director of the IDMC, which for their great work, which actually touches upon our work directly in the MENA region. Today, we are meeting you at the launching of the report that is titled A Decade of Displacement in the MENA region. We understand that the world is still struggling from the hardships that was caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, and it is further increasing the struggle of IDPs in the MENA region. We are also celebrating the launching of the first report on internal displacement in the MENA region. This region that is facing unprecedented changes, whereas the number of IDPs over the past decade has tripled. Undoubtedly, all of the attendees today understand the hard consequences of the forced displacement, as well as the refuge and the economic and the humanitarian and the political effects it leaves on communities and countries. It is an issue that has become a great concern for the international community, which prompted the international organizations working on the humanitarian issues to intensify their work and to actually establish action plans to address the consequences. Undoubtedly, this kind of report that is being launched by the IDMC is essential because it actually provides strong evidence about the gravity of this issue and its risks, and it represents the foundation for discussions about the possible solutions. Qatar Charity, as a humanitarian and a developmental organization, works on providing protection as well as services to save the lives of refugees and IDPs by providing health, education, and also livelihoods, and also ways of return for the IDPs and refugees coming from Syria and Yemen and other affected countries. However, it is also very clear to all of you that the main solution lies in a political commitment at the highest level. And that's why Qatar Charity has signed an agreement with the IDMC in 2018 in order to support the center to expand its knowledge base about the internal displacement and also to provide the decision makers with information to develop and to enrich its decision-making process. However, the biggest challenge that we are facing today is the challenge of establishing policies and procedures. But not only that, the main challenge is establishing these policies and procedures where we need it the most in the countries. And despite the fact that internal displacement is very prevalent, there is still lack of laws and regulations and procedures in the countries that are in most need thereof. Many countries in the MENA region still do not have clear policies on internal displacement. It is a great opportunity today and this makes a great forum for people to discuss and to also take a look at the report by the IDMC and to maybe discuss some potential challenges and potential solutions that will enable internally displaced people to contribute into their communities. Thank you very much for inviting us, and thank you very much for listening. And peace be upon all of you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for these remarks, Mr. Al-Hamadi. I'd also like to hand over the floor to Mr. Al-Shahwani, Shawani from the Qatar Fund for Development, who's Deputy Director General for Development Projects. Now, QFFD is a key partner to the region and is also co-organizing this event with IDMC and Qatar Charities. So over to you, Mr. Shawani.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to talk and to speak and start dialogue with the rest of the team here. Today, there are more than 50.8 million people internally displaced, either by conflict, violence, or disaster worldwide, and an all-time high of which 12.5 million live in the MENA region. 50% of this is women and girls. Is a significant issue that warrant grave attention. The situation has only worsened in 2020. The turmoil of the civil wars and unrest of some of the Middle Eastern countries have forced 1 million out of their homes, turning them into internal displaced, have forced 1 million out of their homes. Also, to make the matters worse, 2020 brought with it the disastrous effect of the COVID-19 pandemic that had a dreadful effect on the livelihood of these already displaced, forcing many of them to lose their homes. This is unsurprising, given the restriction and the moment the pandemic has caused, which is turned a limited employment opportunity of IDPs. This creates a loss of income, threatening IDPs, which lose their homes also. In Yemen alone, 14% of IDPs surveyed lost their homes due to the economic hardship as a result of the COVID-19, with a number expected to be raised even higher in the near future. The highlighted vulnerables means that there must be an even greater focus on supporting these displaced by conflict, violence, or disaster, making reliable and quality data and the report available is a key to ensuring informed and thus more effective response in supporting of IDPs. This said, I'm looking forward to the release of this highly insightful report that will hopefully bring us a step closer to putting an end to, or at least relieve some of the hardship of this displacement. Thank you again, Alexandra, for giving us this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Al-Shawani, for joining us today and for introducing the event with me. I would now like to move on now to the second segment, which is really the discussion of the findings of the report. We have a panel of 4 speakers with us here today, whom I would like to ask to switch on their cameras if they can, so that the audience can now see them. And I will introduce them one by one. We're very pleased to be joined today, first by Mr. Ali Abbas Jahakir, who is Director General of the Branches Affairs Department at the Ministry of Migration and Displaced of the Republic of Iraq. Mr. Jahakir, could you switch off on your camera? I think Mr. Jahakir is experiencing some issues, so we'll see if we can have a picture in a few minutes. Second, I'm very pleased also to be joined by Dr. Sayed Amir Hossein Garakani, who's the head of the National Disaster Research Institute and UNESCO Chair on Natural Disasters Management of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Dr. Garakani, would you be able to switch on your camera as well? I think our 2 first guests are experiencing some issues, so hopefully they'll be able to join us with a picture very soon. Our third speaker is Monsieur Jean-Nicolas Beuz, UNHCR representative in Yemen. Hello, Jean-Nicolas, thank you for being with us. And our fourth speaker is Mr. Mohamed Abu Haloub, Director of the Palestine Field Office. Actually, you're based in Gaza, from Qatar Charity. Welcome, Mohamed. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. We wanted to organize a discussion today, not just to take stock of the scale of the issue that we're reporting on today in the region, and to better understand how internal displacement is affecting local communities across the different countries that we've highlighted in the report, but also to start looking to the future as well, to see if there are some promising practices and methods of work on the ground that, if invested in further, could start to bring some lasting solutions to IDPs. So while we will be collectively reviewing and taking stock of the situation, we'll also try to find some positive examples that can start pointing us to the future. I think, I don't know if we have a connection with Baghdad. Not yet. In that case, if Dr. Garakani can hear me, can you hear me, Dr. Garakani? Okay. In that case, Jean-Nicolas, you are going to be our first speaker, Jean-Nicolas. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm glad that your video is working. Of course, Jean-Nicolas, as a UNHCR representative, you are right now dealing with one of the most acute humanitarian crises in the world, one of the most severe internal displacement crises. And you have been, as in your role as UNHCR, at the forefront of the international community's response to the needs of IDPs. So could you tell us, to kickstart the discussion, what in our view are the main challenges today faced by displaced communities who've been now displaced for several years? We are looking at a protracted situation in Yemen, and share some reflections in particular about the vulnerabilities of these IDPs. I know that you're also working very closely with young women and girls in particular. So if you could tell us about how they have been affected, and how the internal displacement crisis is also compounded by the food security crisis that we know in Yemen. Over to you, Jean-Nicolas.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, and Mabruk for the publication. This is really a milestone of looking back at 10 years of displacement, internal displacement in the MENA region, where I've worked most of my professional life. And I'm very pleased that it is under the auspices of the Qatar Fund for Development and Qatar Charity, who are indeed key partners, not only for IDMC, but for UNHCR and many other international and national NGO here in Yemen and in the region. I think it was really good to hear Mr. Al-Hamadi put immediately the issue on the fact that we humanitarians are not going to solve the whole internal displacement issue. It's really a political matter, and it's something which needs to be addressed by diplomats and politicians. Here, we all remember what Mr. Gutierrez, when he was High Commissioner, said. Humanitarian can only address the humanitarian needs, but it's for the politician and the diplomats to solve the root causes of those internal displacement and refugee flow alike. So I was glad that Mr. Al-Hamadi reminded us of this key point. Here in Yemen, we have a situation where 1 out of 8 Yemeni has been displaced by the conflict. As it's 4 million out of the 30 million Yemeni who have been displaced by the conflict. And as you mentioned, Alexandra, it's already a protracted crisis because it's 6 years of conflict. So some have been displaced 2 or 3 times, and many of them have been displaced for more than 1 or 2 years. Some have been displaced for 5 or 6 years. It's very interesting that your report is also looking both at conflict-related and natural hazards turned into disasters, displacement, because that's very much the situation here in Yemen. And my colleague Erin, who is supporting the country team here on the centrality of protection, also made the point that it is really important to see the overlapping between different causes of displacement, and the fact that the two probably make the solution, but also the prevention even more difficult. In a country like Yemen, for example, we cannot do disaster risk reduction. So any natural hazard turns into a disaster almost immediately. And we have flash flood every year. Last year, they were quite significant, actually. But it's important also, I think many of us will recognize that we put those humanitarian crises in the context of protection crises. When people are being displaced by the conflict, it means that people get killed, people get maimed by landmines, by shelling, people lose their livelihoods, their houses, which all the consequences that we know, not only in terms of their health, well-being, and livelihood, but also in terms of the hardcore of what is the protection risk that people will have if they cannot have a roof above their head in terms of abuse and exploitation of children, of women, of persons with disabilities in those communities where they find temporary refuge. I think it's also very interesting that while we speak a lot about the tension between refugee and host communities, I used to work in Lebanon, which it was really high on the agenda. We are starting more and more to recognize that host communities of IDPs are also to be taken care of. In a I think you lost me.
Yes, we lost you just for a second, but you're back again. Go ahead.
I was just saying that it's important that we recognize also the aspect of the host communities receiving those displaced population. We do a lot in terms of refugees and host communities, whether it's in Lebanon or in the Western world and beyond. But I think there's more and more acknowledgement that we need also to support host communities. Here, 80% of the population relies on humanitarian aid for their daily survival. So I strongly believe, and we have evidence that IDPs are even in the lower level in terms of their socioeconomic well-being and access to health and education and adequate shelter. But the surrounding communities are more or less in the same situation as them. So it's something we need to really keep in mind. Yemen has been very much described these days as a famine crisis, hunger. We have the result from different studies released by WFP, UNICEF, FAO. And this is really very much the focus of the attention of the international community. What people have not said enough, and that has surprised me, to be honest, is the correlation between being displaced and being hungry. And we just did some calculation with colleagues on mapping of the district more at risk of famine and the displacement. And when you overlap the two maps, of course, the displaced are all in the district more at risk of famine. Actually, we realized that displaced population are 4 times more at risk of becoming hungry than the rest of the Yemeni population. And for many of us, it's kind of obvious because they have often lost their livelihood. They don't have any network, community network to survive. Often the breadwinner of the family may have been killed or maimed or injured. But we have not enough, in my view, connected the dots between something like famine and the displacement, conflict, flood related. And I just wanted to end up because Alexandra, you prompted me on specific profile within the IDP population. Here in Yemen, 1 out of 4 family displaced by the conflict is headed by a woman. 1 out of 4. It's an incredibly high numbers. And out of all those families headed by a woman, 1/5 of them are headed by a girl below 18, with often taking care of her siblings. I think this is really something we need to look deeper into in terms of the gender dimension of displacement and how we support those women specifically. In a society like Yemen with the social and cultural norm, everybody will know that it's very difficult for a woman on her own to get her bread and butter, to make a family survive. So what does that mean in terms of increased protection risk that this woman will face in order just to survive? We can say the same about persons with disabilities. We can say the same probably about older persons on their own without the support of younger generation for their survival. So I will stop here, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion with the other panelists.
Thank you very much, Jean-Nicolas. I think some really important points that you've made here, recognizing, as we have done in the report, the confluence of environmental and political factors in driving displacement and increasing vulnerability. Also very interesting to see what you were saying, that displaced communities are 4 times more at risk of food insecurity and famine, which you know is also, I think, a key element to take into account when we think about longer term solutions and prevention. I think the other very important point, which I hope that we can spend a little bit of time discussing today, are the specific demographic profiles of these IDP communities. And the gender dimension in particular, which, as you say, constitutes a huge protection risk today, but it's also going to be a determining factor in future scenarios, in coming up with more targeted responses in the future, and in thinking about the longer term possibilities of reconstruction and rebuilding and reconciliation when you have female-headed households that are at the same time faced with these barriers, these social cultural barriers. So thank you very much, Jean-Nicolas, and I'll come back to you in a minute. I'd just like to see if we've made some progress in getting our friends. No, okay. So Dr. Garakani and Mr. Abbas from Ali Abbas from Baghdad, unfortunately, still not with us to speak about the situation in Iraq and Iran. May I then turn to you, Mr. Abu Haloub Mohammed, joining us from Gaza today. I hope you're still with us, otherwise it's going to make for sure. There you are. Mr. Abu Haloub, you are representing Qatar Charity, responding to the needs of many people, I'm sure, on the ground, but among them IDP communities. And as an operational responder working in very complex environments, Qatar Charity has supported, I think, tens of thousands of IDPs in the region and guided them on the ground in their search for solutions. So building on what Jean-Nicolas just described as the situation in Yemen, can you tell us a little bit more about the way INGOs such as Qatar Charity are responding to the needs of IDPs, and in Palestine and the Gaza Strip in particular, and what are some of those priority needs that you're seeing on the ground? Over to you.
Thank you. First, my greetings to you, Ms. Alexandra, and all the people attending. Thank you for this report that was launched. It is a very important report that we hope that it will be considered by decision makers and policy makers. Regarding the role of Qatar Charity and other INGOs in meeting the needs of IDPs and refugees in Palestine and Gaza Strip, it is very important first to address the need that the responsibility over people, IDPs, lies on the governments themselves, and the role of INGOs is just a complementary role for the role of governments and not an alternative. And we noticed that in protracted crisis about refugees and migration in the last decade, it was confirmed that international communities play a very important role in providing assistance and service and protection to IDPs, especially that governments lack some things, and there are already some problems in countries in providing their own residents with assistance. And if we want to shed the light on the role of the international communities and the interventions that they do in order to meet the people or the needs of people of IDPs, the interventions are based usually on priorities of the needs, the real priorities of needs and IDPs. And it differs from one country to another, but there's also one thing in common, which is the headlines of the interventions. They are all the same in all the countries, because INGOs, they make a very good role. They play a very good role in charity work, and they have many programs and humanitarian response. And there's a lot of interventions, whether in terms of providing assistance, different kinds of assistances like food, other kinds as well, and also in terms of protection and providing shelter, and also providing the minimum limit of healthcare and water needs, and also logistic services and education projects, and especially in areas that suffer from protracted crises like Syria and Yemen, North Syria and Yemen and other countries. Qatar Charity, we had the honor to meet the needs of people, of IDPs, as we mentioned, not only in Gaza, but also in other places like Yemen. And it is a very good witness of the interventions that were made by Qatar Charity. In Palestine, if we ask about if we want to respond to your question regarding the interventions, the humanitarian interventions and the relief interventions, whether in addressing the needs or the problems of IDPs especially during the last decade, Qatar Charity works in Palestine in cooperation with the Palestinian government, and also in coordination with other sectors from the UN branches for humanitarian work. And if we want to shed the light on the history of internal displacement in Palestine, it is the most protracted and longest one, especially that the Palestinians, they have been since 1948, they have been displaced, and also in 1967. And the number, by the end of 2019, more than 6 million people are displaced, and 1 million are in Gaza Strip approximately, and according to the registrations of UNRWA. And Qatar Charity had the very prominent role in meeting the needs of IDPs in Gaza Strip during the last 10 years, and especially in times resulting from the bombing and the armed conflict in 2014, and 2014 was the year that witnessed the most number of IDPs. Around 500,000 civilians were displaced, and Qatar Charity had the honor to distribute aids, whether food or non-food assistances, and also medical needs and health needs, and hospitals working in Gaza as well, in addition to helping the local community and local agencies in providing water services and other kinds of services. This is, in brief, what Qatar Charity has worked in Palestine and in Gaza Strip, and we hope that our efforts will go on in order to bring the IDPs back to their homes safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. You've made a lot of important points that I think are going to feed into this discussion, because the first point that you made was to remind all of us, of course, that the responsibility to protect and to assist and to find long-term solutions to IDPs rests first and foremost with the government, and that the role of international partners such as Qatar Charity and other INGOs and UN agencies is to complement that primary responsibility. But you've also shown just the scale and the breadth of activities that you're carrying out in the region, which is commensurate with the levels of humanitarian needs that we're seeing right now. And I think one of the key aspects of today's discussion is going to be to look at how we can effectively transition away from this, I think something that we all agree is an unsatisfactory focus on short-term emergency assistance towards longer-term development, and how we can work more closely with national governments and put, government action really at the center of this effort. I'll come back to you in a moment, Mohammed. Thank you very much for your intervention. I'm seeing now that we have a picture from Tehran. Dr. Garakani, can you hear me?
Yes. Hello.
Great. Welcome. Very nice to see you. We were getting, I was getting a bit worried. So very nice to have you with us. Dr. Garakani is the director of the Natural Disaster Research Institute in Tehran, in Iran. A research institute that was established in 1990, largely as a response to the catastrophic earthquake that hit Gilan and Zanjan provinces. It has since received a lot of support and struck a lot of partnerships with UN agencies and international partners, and is now involved. It is recognized as the Natural Disaster Research Institute by the Iranian Ministry of Science, Research and Technology, and is involved in a number of research activities in this area, notably on crisis management, on environmental hazards, the rehabilitation of infrastructure, post-disaster reconstruction, as well as economic, social, and physical planning. We're really delighted to have you with us, Dr. Garakani, today. As we've pointed out in the presentation of the reports, the issue of disaster risk reduction, preparedness, and support to communities having to be relocated as a result of these disasters is an extremely important piece of this picture that we've painted of internal displacement in the region. And Iran has a lot of experiences to share with us today. So if I could start perhaps by asking you to tell us, to describe the specific challenges that Iran faces today when it comes to displacement as a country that is prone to earthquakes, to flooding. Please tell us what your experience is. Over to you.
Thanks. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God.
In the name of God.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear audience and participants, dear friends from Arabic-speaking countries, particular Iraq, Qatar, and Palestine. It's my pleasure to be on this webinar and learn from you and share my experience in displacement and relocation in Iran with you. My name is Said Amir Hossein Garakani. I am the head of National Disaster Research Institute and UNESCO Chair on National Disaster Management in Iran. Thanks, Mrs. Balak, for introduction. And these are my valuable staffs because of COVID-19. They will leave the room after a minute and will come back urgent in the 8th time. Now I would like to answer to the first question based on very long-term experience in search and analyze on displacement and relocation in Iran. Also, I am going to focus on rural displacements. The side effects of displacement are sometimes so great that it may disrupt or stop the process of housing reconstruction or cause the process to end of failure. Iran has been exposed to various disasters, and as a result, many villages have to be displaced and relocated. A village in Iran have been relocated as a result of two factors: hazards and development in thus displacement. Among disasters, the most important was our earthquakes, floods, and landslides, which led to 74% of the country's rural locations and displacements. And there are four important dimensions of the effects of rural displacements and settlements in our country, mainly physical, economical, psychosocial, and environmental. The most obvious consequence of relocation in the physical change of the village, most of our country's experience also showed that the relocation of villages has taken place regardless of the physical characteristics of the old village. But here, I want to talk to you about an example that shows the opposites. My first example is related to the earthquake. In 2006, an earthquake occurred in Lorestan province, damaging 3,000 houses. In this earthquake, a village called Baba Pashman was completely destroyed. The village was located on a fault. It was decided to move the village to a land with a distance of about 300 meters from the previous village. The plan of the new village was designed similar to the old one to preserve the former neighborhoods. In the plan of the new village obtained from the 180-degree rotation of the old village, the passage were improved. Therefore, the overall fabric of the village followed the pattern of the old village. Subsequent assessments of this relocation indicate residents' satisfaction. One of the most obvious consequences of rural displacement in Iran is losing the livelihood of residents. Although I am supposed to focus on the last 10 years' experiences, it's good to have a brief look at the past experiences, which have led to change in a managerial perspective on rural relocation in recent years. My second example is about flood in Golestan province. Displacement after 2005 flood in Golestan province have led to new decision 10 years later in 2050. As a result of this flood, 10 villages located near Gorgan River with 1350 households were relocated to a new area and amalgamated there. The new area was located up to 20 kilometers from the previous village. However, the people of this village depended entirely on agriculture and animal husbandry. The village's relocation was done without considering this issue. Only with the goal of relocation was reducing the risk of flood. In addition, the new area, which was selected in haste without conducting preliminary studies, also faced problems such as landslides. In 2050, 10 years later, the increasing return of villagers to their old village, despite of the opposition of local officials, made it necessary to study and re-examine the old relocation policy. The result of the studies was the revival of some old villages with the approach of implementing flood risk reduction measures. The experience clearly showed that this displacement and amalgamating of village without conducting details technical studies and without considering other aspects of people's level is the big mistake. My third example is about psychosocial effects of relocations. It can be said in general that the psychosocial effects of relocations are the most neglected ones. Sorkhekab village in East Azerbaijan province was relocated after 2012 earthquake in an emergency. The disruption of neighborhood relations due to the checkered plan of the new village and the loss of relations and social activities of the people were the result of the displacement. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Dr. Garakani. I think those three examples are very telling of the tensions that we see not just in Iran, but in many other countries in the world, where a government takes its precautions and thinks already ahead to the future and has a certain number of preparedness and early warning mechanisms in place that allow them to relocate their population, their communities out of harm's way of future disasters. But with that, also the tensions that have to come with supervising these relocation processes in ways that don't create new forms of risk for the future. And you mentioned, the psychosocial effects of relocation, the impact that it can have on people's livelihoods, and therefore the need for a well-planned process that is based on advanced consultations, on proper assessments and technical studies. So some very positive examples there, but also I think some crucial lessons that you've learned from these processes and that other countries could certainly benefit from. I will come back to you. I'm assuming that we haven't been able to make contact, unfortunately, with Mr. Jahakir in Baghdad. So let's just plow on and hope that he can join us a little bit later. Actually, I see a camera coming on now. Mr. Jahakir, are you with us? No. Okay, well, while we're waiting for Mr. Jahakir to connect, perhaps I could come back to something that you said, Jean-Nicolas, in your earlier intervention, and which is also linked now to these latest insights that we've received on Iran, where you sorry, excuse me, Jean-Nicolas. Hello, good afternoon, Mr. Jahakir. Welcome. Can you hear me? You need to unmute your microphone. Hello, good afternoon. You are muted. Could you unmute yourself so that we can hear you? No, okay. I think, okay, coming back to you, Jean-Nicolas. Something that you said in your earlier intervention when you were talking about Yemen, you said in Yemen, it's not possible to do DRR. There's a question that's now come up in the chat, and sorry to be skipping straight to it. I know we haven't yet reached the Q&A, but I think it is a key question. We've just heard the experience of Iran that has invested heavily in DRR. What are some of the barriers to doing something similar in Yemen?
No, thanks. I saw the question from Joel, and indeed it's a critical one we always ask ourselves in terms of the prioritization of our intervention. I think there's a mix of issues here. I'm going to be, as usual, a bit controversial. I think most of us in the UN and the international NGO community, contrary to the great example in Iran, are more responders than preventer. We were more trained. I mean, our DNA, or at least for my generation, was more on providing response. So there's a lack of immediate understanding of what you can do in terms of prevention of further displacement, whether they're conflict related or whether they are natural hazard turned disaster. I think there's a distinction that we have to make. Natural disasters are probably easier in terms of addressing them through DDR than conflict-related one. Conflict-related one, you deal with a lot of politics, with military engagement. It's not that easy to identify, even if IHL, the International Humanitarian Law, give us some entry point for movement of people who are too close to a legitimate military target, for example. But it's very complicated in practice to convince the parties to the conflicts to actually engage on those preventive measures. I think there's always the issue, and it should not be an excuse, at least not since the grand bargain a few years ago, of where do you put your meager resources. And yes, we all are pushed towards saving life, and then the preventive measures always kind of dropped in the list of priorities when you have to allocate the resources that you are given. Here, there's also a question to the donors. To which extent are they empowering us, the humanitarians, to really engage in preventive measures when at the same time, in the case, for example, of Yemen, we have to save hundreds of thousands of people from starving to death. But one and the others are the same coin. There are two sides of the same coin, as your report clearly says, and others have said in the past. I think there's also the issue of having the proper legal and policy framework. You need a counterpart to engage into those issues. They are often linked to housing, land and property rights, access to land tenures, access to livelihood, access to education, and we can come back later. But there is quite a number of elements which explain that, very unfortunately, I would say, we tend to respond to the emergency needs, saving lives, rather than preventing the loss of life by having measures way before the displacement is happening, or when displacement has to happen, that it happen in conditions which are in dignity and with good potential for people to build their own resilience to the shock of being displaced.
Thank you very much, Jean-Nicolas. Perhaps if I could come back to Mohammed from Qatar Charity. Do you have any thoughts on this, on the difficult role of international NGOs in going beyond, in trying to kind of stretch the meager resources that you have, to go beyond emergency assistance and start looking towards, resilience building that can then be a form of prevention of future crises? What are the experiences that you've had in trying to bridge those and to transition, between those different phases?
شكرا سيدة ألكسندرا.
Thank you very much, Ms. Alexandra. In fact, I would like to thank Mr. Nicolas for focusing on this very important point, which is the importance to pay attention also to preventive measures that would prevent crises or political crises specifically. So here, if I would make recommendations, I would recommend that we need to make the distinction between the timing of intervention by international organizations and maybe also charity organizations, whereas interventions usually are made into 3 phases. These phases start from pre-displacement, where we should focus on the preventive measures that would prevent displacement. Here in this phase, it is very important to engage in international NGOs and, of course, the support by donors in order to reduce or mitigate the risks of natural disasters, and also to work on sustainable development. And it also includes some practical interventions by some important sectors, including the environmental health, education, as well as public health, and also the economic empowerment and civil peace in many countries. So if we assume that displacement is happening anyways, an educated IDP or even an educated refugee, and many IDPs have become refugees, and the example of that are the Palestinians who have become refugees since 1948. UNRWA, for example, has played a very important role in educating Palestinian refugees in their areas of refuge, whether it was in Jerusalem or in Gaza or in the West Bank, or even in Jordan or Lebanon or beyond. Many of them have become international experts, not only in Palestine, but all around the world. So I need we need to focus on the factors that would prevent displacement before displacement happens. Speaking of the second phase, which is during the displacement, which we have already explained in the intervention by Qatar Charity in Gaza and in Palestine and other countries around the region. But I would like to focus on a very important point as well. In addition to providing humanitarian assistance, it is important to actually promote physical protection of IDPs and refugees, which can come in different forms, including education and training, capacity building. For example, providing basic education, elementary and secondary education for IDPs and refugees would reduce the number of children who are recruited into militant groups. This might apply to African countries as opposed to Palestine. Also, when women are trained on income-making skills and when women become able to work, this would reduce their dependency on relief and assistance. It will also reduce their vulnerability to abuse on the one hand, and it would also reduce their inclination to engage in prostitution or in any other illicit activities, and they will be more capable of protecting themselves and their children against any other violations or abuses. In relation to lessons learned, if we learned anything from the Qatar Charity in Gaza, I would like here to focus that we are trying to facilitate the IDPs return to their main villages, and prior to 2014, and even after that, there were 18,000 housing units that were completely destroyed. Qatar Charity and the majority also of international INGOs and also the Qatar Fund for Development, we adopted the civil approach in rebuilding the destroyed housing units, especially the private and the small housing units. Most of the international NGOs have adopted this approach, which led to faster return of IDPs, and we actually cut more than half of the time. And also we reduced the cost of rebuilding at 30%, as opposed or in comparison to a conventional procurement bill. And of course, we made sure that the beneficiaries are satisfied. This is what I wanted to say, Ms. Alexandra.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. You've introduced also another topic of conversation, which I see a question in the chat room waiting on, which is the issue of return and how to facilitate longer term and sustainable return processes in the region. On that, I'd like to see if we can perhaps get now some audio from Mr. Jahakia joining us from Baghdad. Can you hear me, Mr. Jahakia? Would it be possible to unmute your microphone so that we can hear you? I was hoping to have an intervention from you, because Iraq, of course, is one of the key countries featured in our report, a country that has been heavily affected by some of the largest waves of internal displacement in the region in the last decade, largely linked to the rise and expansion of ISIL. Now, since 2016, the number of IDPs has been declining steadily, which is great news and shows the commendable efforts that have been made by your government in finding solutions and providing effective assistance to IDPs. So if I could ask you to perhaps tell us a little bit about some of the key challenges that Iraqi IDPs still face today, and the lessons that you, as in your role working for the ministry in charge of this question, what are some of the lessons that you've learned from responding to their needs over the years? Over to you, Mr. Jahakia.
Yeah. ترجمة.
Over to you, we can hear you.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
So peace be upon all of you.
أنا أتكلم العربية.
I will be speaking Arabic. I cannot speak English.
بإمكان ترجمة.
So is there a translation available? He asks.
Yes, there is translation. Go ahead.
نعم. أولاً أعتذر عن التأخير.
So first of all, I apologize for joining you late, but I was unfortunately committed to other issues that emerged suddenly, and I would like to also convey the greetings of Her Excellency the Minister. My name is Ali Abbas. I am specialized in internal displacement manners in Iraq. The issue of displacement is actually under the mandate of the Ministry of Immigration and Displacement in Iraq. The displacement that took place after the 2014 events led to tremendous displacement, and the consequence of that was the displacement of about 4.5 million people that had to migrate within short hours, and they took refuge in Kurdistan and other areas of Iraq as a safe haven. The ministry in this regard has taken all of the procedures, and of course the hardship very tremendous, and that's why we resorted to international organizations towards that effort. Of course, we were able to shelter many families. About 174 camps were created and allocated. Weren't able to afford renting that camp actually accommodated 280,000 families. 1.5 million people were actually accommodated in this camp, and the remaining people were living among host communities. After the liberation in 2016, the families started returning to their original villages and towns, and therefore the ministry had committed itself to providing what it can. However, there were a number of challenges and obstacles which the ministry is still, until today, struggles with, but we are trying to overcome these challenges. This includes compensating many of the displaced families because they lost their belongings, and also the farms and ranches that many families had as a livelihood were actually destroyed, and they were burned, so they lost their livelihoods. Also, a large portion of these families' members have joined the terrorist group. So therefore, there is also a social challenge, whereas some families cannot return to their original villages because they cannot fit in within the community as they used to before. So therefore, we need civic peace activities in order to reintegrate these families into the communities and to restore their previous situation. We started also renovating the destroyed housing units, and we provided also caravans for some of the families. The other part of families were included in the housing rehabilitation program in cooperation with the IOM. In fact, the challenges are very tremendous since the displacement was extended for more than 6 years, and this is in itself is a great challenge because it is a displacement that actually went beyond what we have expected, and therefore there are other consequences that will affect the household situation in terms of social integration, as well as the family's ability to access education and healthcare and also other services. the issue of remaining in the camps have become a great challenge. So that's why we started shutting down the camps and returning these families after launching a survey which covered all of the camps, through which we concluded that the majority of these families are willing to return if the environment is safe enough and if there are basic services available and if they can live a decent living in these return areas. Of course, a number of these procedures have been conducted by the ministry in cooperation with local NGOs as well as international NGOs. It is true that there are actually hiccups in some of the areas due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and also since the general budget was also hit by the declining prices of oil. Therefore, it was very difficult to allocate enough funds to rehabilitate the housing units as well as to provide the basic services that people need in their original villages and towns. However, we are exerting our best effort along with the international community to find quick solutions to meet these challenges. Right now, what we still have left is 26 camps where 40,000 families dwell. The majority of these families are coming from Sinjar, Yazidi families who had fled Sinjar city and who were persecuted and were subject to rape by their women and even abduction by their women were abducted. So the return is very difficult right now. This requires a lot of preparation in Sinjar for their return. They need psychosocial support specifically for the girls who were subject to rape or physical violence. So therefore, we need more time and more programs to reintegrate them into the community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ali Abbas. You've already gone into the next round of questions that I was hoping to ask you regarding this next phase of reconstruction, reconciliation, and return that Iraq has entered recently, and which I think holds much hope. But as you say, there are remaining obstacles along the way, and it's not going to be a linear trajectory, I think, in that direction. But it would be very useful if you could just, if I may just keep you for another couple of minutes, because I don't want to lose you again. If you could perhaps just tell us in a little bit more detail what in your view have been the main factors in facilitating this process of return. What were the trigger points that it allowed the government to really start investing in this next phase of displacement? And what do you see as the prognosis in the coming months and years?
I don't believe Mr. Ali selected interpretation, so he probably does not hear the Arabic interpretation.
Okay.
Of the questions.
Okay, let me then circle back. Okay. Dr. Garakani, I'd like to come back to you, and I see that there's a question in the chat that you're probably going to be best placed to answer. But it relates to what I wanted to ask you in more general terms, whether you could share some experiences from, or some lessons from the Iranian experience that could be relevant in other countries. There's a question that has come that refers to the fact that by 2040, most of the countries in the region will fall in the category of extremely high water stress. We all know what the effects of a scarcity of water resources can have, not just on the direct livelihoods of communities, but also as a potential factor in a potential destabilizing factor in generating more conflict in the future. So knowing the future risk of water stress in the region, and knowing that it is likely to generate more internal displacement, to cause more people to flee their homes, what do you think are the key lessons that we can learn when it comes to preparing for this scenario, for relocating perhaps communities away from those areas of high risk? And what would be your recommendations, basically, to share with other countries?
Yes. Here I would like to speak about disaster risk management and disaster risk awareness. A changing in approach occurred in the earthquakes of Gilan and Zanjan in 1990. 107 rural settlements were relocated, not only because of a geological problem, but also because of the problems of debris removal and difficulty and time-consuming process of in situ reconstruction. Today, this view in gradually abandoned and locations are made only for technical and environmental reasons, based on feasibility study and with the aim of reducing the risk of settlements. In 2019 flood in Golestan, Lorestan, and Khuzestan province, National Disaster Research Institute was one of the consultants in the field of rural relocation. In Khuzestan province, out of 328 villages that were introduced, 180 villages needed a review and safety plan. In practice, rural relocation were cancelled for a number of reasons, such as the study's results entitled Rapid Assessment of the Social Situation of 31 floods villages in Khuzestan province, carried out by Islamic Revelation Housing Foundation in consultation with the University of Tehran. It showed that the residents did not prefer and would not accept displacement and preferred tackling flood risk reduction measure instead. A research project on the rural settlements displacement in Islamic Republic Housing Foundation started in 2014. The results of this study indicated the displacement of about 900 villages in period of 35 years, 1979 until 2014. This number has surprised the country's executive because it was a sign of a managerial perspective among decision makers regarding rural settlements. Further, studies in this regard have yielded interesting results, which I will discuss in the following. Mistaken decision support system and decision-making systems was the root of wrong relocate rural settlement, were based on simplifying and accelerating the implementation process. And the most important reasons of failure of displacement in Iran can be summarized as follows. Displacement and relocation are not well defined here, and their negative consequences have not been enough analyzed and determined. In a way, the decision maker and executives displacement and relocation as a development project. The views of decision maker and executive during the relocation of villages are limited to physical dimensions, not paying attention to such important issue of relocation like finding a new site, designing the site and buildings, people participation and allocation of plots of land. One of the results of this research project was establishing a database of rural displacement in Iran. In response to the challenge identified, a guideline was developed. The guideline defines the process of making decisions and the method of intervening in 5 main stages. Also, if relocation is necessary, important considerations explained in a book entitled Considerations of Relocation of Rural Settlements. In addition to the mentioned guideline, a housing reconstruction plan was prepared in Islamic Relation Housing Foundation as an executive body in the field of displacement and relocation of rural settlements. This plan also emphasizes avoiding displacement. It may be interesting if I provide you with a short description of new disaster management documents in Iran. The new disaster management law was approved on August 2017 and was notified to the Ministry of Interior by the President of Iran for implementation. Following the approval of this law and its notification, the process of preparing plans and regulations starts. The National Disaster Management Organization of Iran was responsible to prepare the national disaster strategy related to Sendai framework of disaster risk reduction and more than 20 other plans and regulations. The organization gave the responsibility to National Disaster Research Institute, the only specialized center in the field of national disaster in Iran. Here, I would like to mention a brief summary of the results of this efforts concerning the statute of risk in Iran. The list of known hazards in the country indicates the occurrence of 56 different hazards in different parts of the country, including earthquakes, floods, and landslides, and drought, etc. One of the notable items in this list is the hazard related to the climate change. Therefore, climate change can be one of the serious reasons or routes for further displacement in our country. Depending on determining of vulnerability and exposure, it can be predicted that our country will be greater risks in the next 10 years. Therefore, more displacement are going to be occurred. The National Disaster Strategy of Iran, which was drafted in accordance with the Disaster Management Law, as I mentioned before, oversees the desired further of the country's disaster management in the next 10 years. With regard to the importance of the issue of displacement in Iran, in the fourth objective of the third strategy of this document, the priority action is explained as follows: prioritizing in adoption of an in-situ reconstruction policy rather than the policy of relocating in risk reduction and reconstruction. In addition, in the National Reconstruction and Rehabilitation Plan, it emphasizes that reconstruction planning should avoid displacement and relocation without strong technical studies and reasons and without involving the public. And I'd like to explain briefly about a milestone in disaster risk reduction in Iran. Form 2021, in about 12,500 villages will be down the risk analyzed by NDRI. A project for prioritizing villages needing protective measure to reduce risks with multi-hazard approach and make them resilient, such as retrofitting and building bypass canals to mitigate a flood, has been commenced in National Disaster Research Institute, in result in a less displacement in further. Relying on the scientific and executive potential in National Disaster Research Institute, we would be very glad to share our experience with our neighborhood and the other countries needing our assistance. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Dr. Garakani, and thank you for these important reminders regarding, on the one hand, the need, the critical importance of existing legal and normative frameworks. So the fact that a lot of the work that you've done in Iran is underpinned by a national DRR strategy, which has guided you also in these relocation processes. But also the critical importance of the right kind of data and knowledge, including risk assessments assessments of future risk. And we were talking about it yesterday, this example that you just gave of risk assessments being conducted in, I think it was 2,500 villages right now across Iran, to then ensure that relocation processes are informed by a sound evidence base, can happen in the most participatory way possible, and can lead to sustainable outcomes for those affected. So thank you very much for those important examples that I think many other countries could certainly learn from. I'd like to just see if Mr. Ali Abbas is back with us. So that we can perhaps come back to the question of returns in Iraq. So I think you now have access to the interpretation. So I will ask my question again. As you were saying, Mr. Jahakir, Iraq has really now entered a new phase of reconstruction, of reconciliation, which I think holds much hope for the return and for the sustainable reintegration of Iraqi IDPs, but also refugees. You did mention some of the obstacles that are still in the way, but I would be interested in hearing from you what have been the main factors that have facilitated this move towards facilitating the return and ending the displacement for so many tens of thousands of IDPs. And what do you see as the prognosis, despite these obstacles? What is the prognosis for the coming months and years?
Thank you, and I'm sorry if I was not able to talk about the topic in a way that should be, but I hope that I will be elaborate more on this topic now. There's a lot of challenges we talked about already. These challenges were by a survey that I mentioned, the first phase in my talk. I talked about the survey, and it was summarized in some security options, security challenges, social also, and economic, and logistic and services. If we talk about the security, there's many areas. There's a lot of fragile security situation, and many families that were displaced, they were not able to feel reassured or to feel safe to go back to these areas because of the security, a fragile security situation in these areas that were liberated, and they were not covered by totally by the military, and there are some things they do not feel safe and reassurance about going back to these areas. So that's why also we're talking about we're talking about working with the Ministry of Interior in order to spread the security again, and to make a big widespread, to ensure that there's no leaking of any terrorists to these areas through the borders, the Syrian borders, because Syria now is the influential. It influences the situation in Iraq because of the borders that we have. Considering it's a big borders and more than 600 kilometers, and Now the sectors have started working on the borders and having more control and monitoring in cooperation with the National Alliance and with the International Alliance. And also there is some areas until now they were not cleared from the war residues, like the bombs, and some things, explosives, and this influences the areas that were especially people with farms and with fields in that area. These challenges and social, this one I mentioned was the security. Now the social challenges. A lot of these families have some engagements with some family members that are in ISIL as well, and they are accused, their families or their children are accused of being part of ISIL during the displacement, or one of the reasons they were displaced was because of a family member engaged with ISIL. So this will affect their coming back to their areas and returning safely. This happened in the first phase. And also we have some infrastructure problems, or infrastructure for the 5 governorates. They are completely destroyed as infrastructure, and the government was the Iraqi government. What it built since 1921, it was destroyed and devastated because of ISIL and its control over the areas. And also whatever is left was destroyed by the operations, or the liberation operations, or the military operations as well. This in itself is a very big challenge for the return of the families. Without any roads, there's no electricity. This is like another displacement for them if they return, because the basic needs of life is not present at these areas. And also no work opportunities. Many people who were working in farming and agriculture, it was influenced because they lost their work or means of living or livelihood. So this is, we worked on distributing the problems, or distinguishing the problems and working them on them separately in separate files. In the security field, as I said, we want to spread the sectors again, and to work and to let the youth volunteer, or the family or the youth of these families volunteer in order to revive these areas. And the families started to stabilize and to make sure to feel better about returning home. And also we worked with UNHCR and other organizations to rehabilitate institutions and service institutions, service providers. Yes, the organizations usually they are influenced with funding, by the donors, all the donors. So that's why it does not rise up to the level sometimes of what is needed, or the effect or the impact that has been made, because Iraq was the first forefront, or the first stage in front of, the first thing in front of ISIL. So it was mostly affected. And it affected many neighboring countries as well. But Iraq has tolerated a lot by ISIL, and there was a lot of sacrifices done in order for the safety and the security of Iraq and the neighboring countries. And it was the country that fought ISIL the most and protected, and we suffered the residues of this. And it was many sectors were influenced as well and impacted. And there remained some units, terroristic units that wanted to prove their existence, and they did some activities in these areas that impacted the social, or the social peace and the community peace. Until now, they cannot control a lot, because it's mostly under control. And also the reconciliation, part of the reconciliation needs a confrontation before reconciliation, meaning that we should invest the heads of tribes and the representatives of social tribes in order to confront each other and to discuss, because women and children, they do not have the right, or they do not have the, they cannot be blamed for what the youth have done. So the community should accept that this is a black page that has influenced and impacted the community a lot, the Iraqi community, and the Iraqi community should forget and heal its wounds and to move to the new level, to the new phase. And it is not correct to just remain prisoners of the past and the prisoners of the black phase. And we should jump forward to the new phase, because ISIL and its impact and its control, it has been going on for many years, and in some places it's 4 years. So of course it implemented the community and it affected the community. And rehabilitation and restoration of houses, we coordinated with organizations, but the rehabilitation is only 10 to 12% of the whole suffering process. We have more than 100,000 families in camps, and right now, and between Kurdistan region, and only 10,000 have returned home, and now remains around 100,000 families, and their villages have been all destroyed. You can't even find any impact or any you cannot see any kind of villages because they're completely destroyed by ISIL, and even nothing remained safe and nothing remained there, and nothing remained intact. And also we have a problem with the areas that are located on the borders of Syria, and some problems, political problems, between the region and the center that has been controlled by Peshmerga, and now they are Arabic areas under the control of the Kurdish military, the Kurdish groups, and this influences the security situation as well. And these families, it will be difficult for them to return to their areas because they are cautious about, or they are reserved about going to their villages. Many of these reasons, we are working on solving these reasons on different levels, on the level of the government and the leadership of the country, and working with the Kurdistan. And this is proved by the document that was signed with regarding Sinjar, and it is one of the reasons that the ministry made the both parts deal with the displacement issues. And we do not have right now in the camps around 40,000 families remains, and in the upcoming months we hope that we hope to work on returning them home, but under the condition that the things that I mentioned will be provided, and the challenges that were the reason for them not to return earlier will be solved. And we want all the families to be in peace and to feel at peace, but it does not rise up to the level right now, to the level of what is needed, but there are efforts, and there's a lot of burden also on the budget of the government, and it needs a lot of time and a lot of coordination. And we are not talking about the displaced outside of Iraq, because if we talked about refugees outside of Iraq, they are huge numbers of Iraqi refugees outside of Iraq. They're not less. They are a big number. We have 4.5 million Iraqis outside of Iraq displaced, and they live in neighboring countries and European countries and America. And seeking refuge is still ongoing until now. And we're only talking about the IDPs and the internally displaced people that we can see in Iraq.
Thank you very much.
Whatever is Iraq is different. Outside of Iraq is different. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jahakia. I think you've really illustrated very well the challenges that still remain and the enormous challenge that it represents to facilitate this return process, which is not just a physical movement of one person or of persons from one place to another, but very much a combination of investments across security, stability, as you said, infrastructure, the rebuilding of the social fabric, reconciliating communities, allowing service providers to resume their work on the ground. And as you said, Iraq isn't just dealing with the return of IDPs, but also of refugees in the region. So a lot of, a huge endeavor and effort ahead of you, which I'm sure the international community is fully supportive of right now. I would like to perhaps, I'll ask this question to Mohammed. There's a question that has come in the chat, which I think is a very relevant one. We've just spent a lot of time reflecting on what a return process should look like. But one question that has come is, what about local integration as a solution to displacement? Local integration is a solution that doesn't often get talked about. We ourselves in IDMC have very few examples to mention in our report. Mohammed, you mentioned that Qatar Charity was involved in supporting return processes, but have you also got examples of successful local integration efforts in some areas of this region?
Alexandra, experience or the case of Palestine, especially in the last decade, especially for IDPs, is moderate compared or humble compared to the neighboring countries like Iraq and Yemen and other countries, many other countries. But also, even though it is simple, during the 51 days of internal displacement of 500,000 of civilians during the war in 2014, but it was an experience that supported integration, social integration between, and I was one of the displaced, by the way, and I went to one of the friends who hosted me during all this period of the war. And even despite of that, if there are any positive steps for the returning of displaced people, and it's a phase that comes after the displacement or the end of the reasons, when the reasons end, whether wars or the floods or the displaced returning will have needs, constant humanitarian needs, and this requires constant support, and the organizations, the INGOs and funding and the donors should give more attention and money to meet the needs of this space when they return, and the relocation for the return and relocation, and the consistency between the development and the relocation, that when they participate is an essential thing for them to participate. And this leads to a sustainable and constant solution. And in order to facilitate that, the programs should start, programs that support or promote their self-dependency, and they should be integrated as well in the aids provided. And here comes the role of the participation of INGOs in in reintegrating them, including the assistance in fixing the shelters and providing and building more shelters, and also equal to provide equal services to everybody for the public services like education, like healthcare, and pension, and to let the families return to each other, which will constitute to or contribute to have more reconciliation. And the last point is to the economic reintegration, which is represented by having equal work opportunities to provide, to generate income and to provide livelihood. And this is how the IDPs come. They do not have to depend for long on the assistance. And of course, the participation of NGOs and governments is important, and it is conditioned by the end of the armed conflict as well, and the military things. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for these reflections, Mohammed. We're reaching the end of the Q&A, but I would like to turn to Jean-Nicolas. I'm sure, Jean-Nicolas, you would have something to add to the question of solutions. And do you have any reflections on this issue about local integration in particular? Why is that generally less readily considered as a viable option?
It was fascinating to hear Mr. Jacques here in particular and his experience in northern Iraq, as well as Mohammed. But before going to local integration, let me touch on 2 points which I think are critically, or 3 points which I think are critically important. First, we speak always about local integration and return, but there's another, at least temporary solution which we need to keep open. Is for people to cross an international border and seek asylum and become refugees. There are situations where we know IDPs feel, for whatever reason, still at risk, under threat, or are actually persecuted as IDPs. And therefore, I think it's important that we keep in mind that borders needs to remain open for those IDPs to eventually, if they choose to, become refugees and are protected under a different regime. That's the first point I wanted to make. The second point is Mr. Jackie reminded me of the situation of the Yazidi. And it's a very specific situation. But in that case, we were able to adapt the resettlement process for refugees for IDPs. It was quite unique, but a number of people displaced in northern Iraq, Yazidi women in particular, who had faced those horrendous crimes against their physical integrity, were actually resettled in Canada. And I was at that time for UNHCR in Canada. It was a complicated process. It's one which is unique, that has been explored by many, called protective relocation for internally displaced. It's not something that many of us are very comfortable with, given the legal, diplomatic, and practical implication, but that's something we need to keep in mind, that in extreme cases, we may have to extract some people with the consent, and that was the case in northern Iraq, with the consent of the authorities, for them to find a solution, a durable, a dignified solution in a third country. I'm very passionate about the issue of involving the private sector into our business. And I think it will be also interesting to see through legal pathways such as immigration, there will be not also solution for some of those IDPs to find a solution in a third country. Labor schemes, for example, may be contemplated in some of the options. The third point that I wanted to make, and it will come back to probably local integration, is the issue of transitional justice. I work with OHCHR in northern Uganda, a massive internal displacement due to the Lord Resistance Army. And it's absolutely critical that we engage the IDPs from the onset of any peace negotiation and on all those transitional justice mechanisms. Because we need to understand what, in the context of displacement, justice means for them. Is it about land tenure? Is it about the perpetrator being held to account and being jailed? Is it about receiving a livelihood for them to resume a life? The concept of justice in the case of a peace negotiation, especially for displaced population, it's the same with refugees, but I would say there's something very specific about IDPs because they have remained within the same society, the same country, is something that we need to explore far more, because this is, as Mr. Jacques here, one of the key issues in terms of reconciliation with your neighbors and the potential of reintegration. Now, in terms of return home or to the place of origin or local integration, I think, again, there may be some distinction to be made between those who have been displaced by natural disasters and those displaced by conflict. But that's for another day, most probably. What I think would be very interesting is to speak about the infamous nexus. I think Alexandra, yourself, or one of the panelists mentioned how we can link our humanitarian work to the development work in terms of finding solutions to IDPs. And this is really at the core of finding solutions. Mr. Jack here said it very clearly. It's about rebuilding houses, providing new livelihood opportunities, rebuilding the education system so that there is a future for the children who have been displaced and returning home. But here is really the question of how we are using our humanitarian money to do more than putting a band-aid on an open wound, the open wound being the displacement, and look into how we support IDPs. Since the Grand Bargain and even before, cash has become a bit the magic bullet that a lot of donors and humanitarians are using to address the needs of people being displaced. What we don't do enough, in my view, is how do we transform cash into cash for work, into opportunities for livelihood, into seed money for people to be able to build their own resilience and therefore not be completely dependent on external humanitarian aid. How do we use our shelter intervention, which are often very much emergency shelter kit, immediately after the flood, immediately after the house being bombed in the conflict? How do we use our shelter to really help people to stabilize if there's an opportunity of local integration or to return? What does that mean in terms of urbanization? A lot of IDPs are congregating, like refugees, like migrants, towards urban center because there are more opportunities for them to survive. What does that mean in terms of new way of conceiving the city? And there's a few of colleagues on the chat who are working on local council cities. I think this is a critical point. The last point is really on HLP right. My friend Behram mentioned it in the chat. The whole issues of land tenures, whether it's for local integration or return, is absolutely critical. And in this part of the world, but it's true in sub-Saharan Africa and certainly in Afghanistan where I've worked, I don't know in Latin America whether it's the same, but because of the tribal structure, because of the informal mediation mechanisms which exist in society, because of the lack of written document in terms of your ownership of the land of the house, it's something which is extremely complicated. We know that NRC with their ICLA project has been working a lot on those issues of HLP rights, housing, land and property rights, but I think it's really at the core of finding solution, especially in terms of local integration, with the issue of reconciliation, justice, and integration into livelihood, education, and public services altogether.
Thank you very much, Jean-Nicolas. Very good way, actually, of ending this this conversation with a lot of concrete examples. So thanks for those last insights. I'm afraid we've reached an end to this event. We're going to have to wrap up. I apologize that we weren't able to answer all the questions that that came up in the chat. If you do want to get in touch with us, don't hesitate to do so. Also, bear in mind, we've put all the links to the report as well as to some additional information on the work of the NDRI in Iran. If you're interested, if you haven't been able to click on the link in the chat, again, don't hesitate to contact the IDMC team. I will just be wrapping that by saying I think we've covered a lot of ground. The point of today's discussion and the launch of this report was to try and give a renewed look on, unfortunately, an old and protracted now problem in the region. And I hope we've been able to do that. We very much hope that this report can provide a baseline for future action. We've talked about a lot of things, from government's ultimate responsibility on the importance of continuing diplomatic efforts, of continued political will to find political solutions to particularly conflict displacement that is quintessentially a political problem, the importance of legal and normative frameworks to underpin future strategies, the critical importance of the right kind of data and knowledge to inform programming, including information on future risks, so that we can start really investing in prevention and risk reduction. The huge challenges that are involved in finding longer term solutions, whether they are returns, local integration, or indeed, as Jean-Nicolas said, seeking asylum abroad. I think we had a lot of examples of just how much investment is needed from security, infrastructure, social fabric, transitional justice, reconciliation. And of course, recognizing that any solution will have to be intrinsically linked to the original cause of the displacement and ultimately to people's individual preferences. We hope that this has sparked a bit of new thinking to all of you. The objective of today was to really create more dialogue, to think about different types of partnerships. We've had government perspectives on this. We've had the perspectives of the academic, a national research institute. Jean-Nicolas was talking about the importance of the private sector. We have got the UN sector represented here. Again, none of this will be possible without a concerted effort and collective action. One final point that I hope we can all reflect on is something that came up earlier on in a sort of change in working methods and practices that is ultimately needed. The fact that there is recognition that for too long we've been sort of dependent on short-term emergency assistance for a problem that now requires something much more sophisticated and long-term. So how can we effectively transition away from that short-term assistance into a longer-term form of recovery and sustainable development, and what kind of practical changes in our collective working methods are needed on the ground? I think that is food for thought for the future. I would like to thank all of you for joining us today. I would like to thank Mr. Al-Hamadi and Al-Shawani for co-introducing this and co-launching this report and organizing the event with us today. Thank you for your introductory remarks. Thank you very much to Mr. Jahakia joining us from Baghdad. Apologies that the IT wasn't always easy, but it was I think fantastic to get your perspectives. Dr. Garakani, I hope we can stay in touch. Well, I'm sure we will stay in touch and learn more from your work in Iran. Jean-Nicolas, thank you very much for joining us from Yemen today. I'm sure we'll meet again. And Mohamed Abu Haloub, excellent perspectives from the ground, from an operational agency, and from our key partner, Qatar Charity. So thank you to all of you for joining us. And do stay in touch. And everyone, have a good day, a good rest of the week. And thanks again for joining this event. Bye-bye.